And a very pleasant good evening to everybody. It is Sunday, May 13th, 2018, just after 9 p.m., and you are tuned in to the very special edition of the Connoisseurs of Wrestling. It's like a wine tasting, except with classic wrestling. We're here to kind of give you just a little taste of that classic wrestling goodness that made us all lifetime fans. This is our new home, Sunday evenings, 9 p.m., right here on YouTube. Just want to thank everybody that's made the first three episodes of the Connoisseurs of Wrestling just an absolute smashing success. Everybody involved with the show is just thrilled to death with how everything has turned out. And we got a lot more great content for you, so please keep tuning in every Sunday night, 9 p.m. Eastern, right here on the official channel of the Connoisseurs of Wrestling. It is a big show for us here tonight. We got an excellent topic to talk about, but first, some big news about our show. We are so pleased to welcome a brand new co-host into the mix. She is one of the most famous contributors at Cage Side Seats, the ever popular, the indomitable, the incomparable LegendsLover, the curator of the Connoisseurs of Wrestling. LL, welcome to the Connoisseurs officially. It's your big debut night as an official co-host. How you doing tonight? Huh. Absolutely speechless, apparently. We'll get that all worked out. We're having all sorts of buggy problems here tonight, guys, but we're going to figure it out. It's going to be a really great show tonight. Of course, we've got Taker's Meaning here as well from the Shooting the Breeze podcast. My name is Biff Kensington. I am from the Queen City Express podcast. And basically what this show is all about, we're just talking good old school classic wrestling. It's going to be a great show tonight. We have all sorts of great topics lined up. Of course, if you're new to the channel, we have a couple of episodes available. Last week's episode was focusing on the extraordinary legacy of the American Wrestling Association, the AWA. We've also talked about the late, great Bruno Sammartino and the Jumping Bomb Angels. We have all sorts of content on the way as well. Tonight's episode, of course, is very special, and hopefully we'll get these technical issues worked out here relatively soon. But in the meantime, while we wait on our co-host to get back, I'm just going to kind of set the table here for tonight's episode. We're talking about one of the all-time great managers in the history of professional wrestling, a legend of the AWA, the WWF, and all points in between. Of course, we're going to be talking about the great Bobby the Brain Heenan. And I know that both Taker's Meaning and LL have a lot to say about this particular individual. Hopefully, we got him back now. Taker, LL, y'all with us here?
I'm here, but I don't know about her. Can you hear me? No, I can't hear you. You're not. How about now? Hold on. I'm going to work with her again. Hold on.
All right, y'all go ahead, and I'll go ahead and set the table a little bit here. I apologize for the technical issues. It's a beta run, folks. Going live Sunday night, but you know what? We're going to work through everything because we just want to bring this content to you. It's really fascinating to talk about old school wrestling, and it's especially fascinating to talk about the real magnetic personalities that make wrestling so much fun. You look at someone like Bobby Heenan, of course, who's the subject of tonight's episode. Now, we are not possibly going to be able to cover everything of Bobby Heenan's legendary career. There's just way too much to cover. But we have, a lot of discussion points here tonight that we're going to talk about. Of course, this kind of continues on from our AWA talk last week. Bobby Heenan, one of the great personalities in the history of the AWA. We'll be looking at some of his career highlights. We'll be getting some firsthand memories from LegendsLover and Taker's Minion both, who I'm sure both have a lot of memories of Bobby Heenan from his time in the Midwest. Of course, we'll be looking at Bobby's start in the business. We'll be looking at his AWA run. We'll also be looking, of course, at some of the highlights that precipitated the character that we all know and love, from Pretty Boy Heenan to the Weasel. Of course, we all know him as Bobby the Brain Heenan, and everyone today recognizes Bobby as one of the greatest wrestling personalities. It's interesting, he had a, kind of a jack of all trades approach by the end of his career. He started off as a great manager. He was also a good worker, but also a great commentator. He could do a little bit of everything. And so we're looking real forward here tonight to talking about Bobby Heenan. And I'm hoping that we got everything fixed. LL, you're with us. We got you back.
Hopefully, yes.
Well, I'm glad
we had to completely get me out of this and put me back in for volume. We don't know what happened.
It's been one technical snafu on everybody's end tonight. It's like the universe is working against us, but by God, we're going to get some Bobby Heenan discussion going. So,
oh yes, definitely.
So I just want to thank you again for being here. Of course, as we mentioned at the outset of the show, LegendsLover, the curator of the Connoisseurs, she's our official channel historian. She's going to be joining us as a co-host, lending her experience. Watching wrestling, growing up, watching the business, kind of giving a little bit of her perspective on how things have changed over the sorts of great about. And hopefully we have Taker's Minion back with us here momentarily as well.
I'm here.
I got to give you the formal introduction too, man. You're worthy of it. The godfather of podcasting. Of course, he is one half of the tandem that hosts the Shooting the Breeze podcast Saturday mornings, 11 a.m. Eastern on YouTube. The one, the only, the legend, Taker's Minion, my friend. That's quite the intro today, but how you doing?
Tonight's been one of those nights that whatever could go wrong has gone wrong, but I digress. I mean, it's great to be here. It's great to be talking about Raymond Lewis Heenan, a.k.a. Pretty Boy Bobby Heenan. That's how I'll always remember him. You know.
Well, luckily for y'all, I am great at blowing hot air. I'm filled with hot air, so we're all good on that end. But, you know, a lot of people think Bobby Heenan used to be full of hot air, too. We're just going to jump right into it here tonight, guys, because really, like I was saying, we've got so much to cover. We're not going to possibly get it done in one episode.
No.
This is definitely going to be a multiple episode shot. So, Taker, I'm going to start with you. Your first memories of Bobby Heenan. Where did you first see him? How old were you? Where was it?
It was in the old AWA in Chicago. First time I saw him was on television. He was affiliated with Nick Bockwinkel and Ray Stevens. And he was their manager, and he kept saying he wanted to go by Bobby the Brilliant One, but they still called him Pretty Boy, Sam Menaker and company. Now, there's a name of people that, you know, if you want to know who Sam Menaker is, look him up on Wikipedia. Also, you can look him up on YouTube because he was play-by-play, single-man booth, by the way. No color commentary. This is how it was back then. Single man. And he did the play-by-play for the wrestling in Indianapolis, you know, any tapings in Indianapolis, Hammond, Indiana, and Chicago. You could say the Gordon Soley, if you will, of WWA, AWA.
That's high praise.
He was good for his time. It was always known for wearing dark glasses, like sunglasses all the time. They were heavy, they were real thick prescription glasses, and he had them dark tinted so you wouldn't know how deep they were. He was legally on the point of being blind, but yet
kind of like a Stan Hansen almost.
He was wearing Coke bottle glasses. So I actually saw him at ringside one night at the amphitheater, and that's when I realized just how thick his glasses were. I was like, whoa. I think I was like 8. I was like 6 or 7 when I first saw Bobby, and he, you know, running his mouth about how great Stevens and Bockwinkel were. And, you know, that was one of his first tag teams in the AWA. If I'm not mistaken. Let me check my notes here. Got about 12 pages of notes.
There's just so much that you have with Bobby Heenan. I mean, he's got so many people. We were talking a little bit off the air about, you know, just how many people Bobby has managed over the years. It's not only a long list, but it's a who's who of wrestling history.
It is.
Just looking at the AWA names, you know, you mentioned Nick Bockwinkel, Ray the Crippler Stevens, looking at guys Blackjack Lanza, Bobby Duncombe Sr. were in there.
The Valiant
Really,
Brothers.
yeah, a lot of the big names from the AWA were in there in the 1970s. Of course, Bobby Heenan started out in the AWA in 1974, but what a lot of people may not know is that that was not actually his start. He got his start a little bit earlier than that, and this would be a great chance for LegendsLover to jump in here and kind of give us the lowdown on some of Bobby's earlier work. Of course, she's been doing all sorts of research on this topic. So LegendsLover, we'll go ahead and pose the question to you. When was the first time you saw Bobby Heenan, and what are some of your earlier memories about the Brain?
Well, when I first seen him, it was on TV also, and it was the AWA. Like TM said, he was, time I first seen him, he was manager of Ray Stevens and Nick Bockwinkel before Bockwinkel became champion.
All right,
but I do know when he started out in the the WWA is where Bobby Heenan actually started with the promotion of Dick the Bruiser.
That's an interesting name. We brought him up a little bit last week, obviously in our AWA episode, but as a fan in this era, and as a fan watching the programming live, how prevalent was Dick the Bruiser on the AWA's programming? Was he considered one of their top stars? Was he kind of more of a special attraction? Of course, everyone has a good Dick the Bruiser story that was watching from that era. What was Dick the Bruiser like?
Dick the Bruiser, he was a top star in the AWA. He used to tag team with Crusher all the time. Him and Crusher, they used to star everywhere in the AWA. They were champions. Those two would fight each other. They'd fight anybody around. But what a lot of people did not know is Dick the Bruiser was also a promoter and an owner of another territory. He went back and forth.
Yeah, Bruiser and Crusher were just a couple of damn barroom brawlers that got into wrestling, basically.
Well, I want to touch on a point Ella mentioned, and Taker, I'm going to get you to jump in on this too. It's kind of interesting how in the territorial era, you had guys that could have an ownership stake in one territory, but then kind of work in another territory. Of course, everyone knows Ole Anderson was working, kind of had an ownership stake down in Georgia Championship Wrestling, but he was also working his shots in the Carolinas. Of course, Dusty Rhodes would move around. This is where Bobby Heenan got his start, though. He got his start with Dick the Bruiser in the World Wrestling Association, which was based out of Indianapolis, if I'm not mistaken.
That's correct.
And he would also kind of parlay that into a run with the AWA later on in his career. So it's interesting to see kind of how not just, superstars would cross the line, but how these promotions, they would kind of bleed in together a little bit. There was some pretty significant crossover between the WWA and the AWA.
Yeah, it was significant because they, back in those days, back in the early days of wrestling, you worked where you could make money, and where the WWA was located, which was in Indianapolis. So that's where Bobby got his start. He started out just as a member of ring crew, and he was carrying bags and jackets and selling refreshments at the arenas. That's how he got into the business and worked his way up from there. So he started out at the very, very bottom, basically being the gopher for the wrestlers that were on the shows. And you don't have that today. You don't have wrestlers paying those kinds of dues anymore.
That right there, I want to bring that out, and I want to get you to elaborate on that a little bit, because we hear old wrestlers talk about that all the time, talking about paying dues and earning your way through. And you mentioned, Bobby started out, he's basically a vendor for the company working at first. He's basically working his way all the way from the very bottom up to the top. of course, and that's not, an uncommon story for performers. Jim Cornette, another manager, legendary manager we'll be talking about in a later episode. He started out as a ringside photographer. Jerry Lawler started out by sketching people for the local program. So it's funny to, talk about some of how, these performers that we think of as legends in the business now, they had really humble beginnings. So kind of take us through that a little bit and talk a little bit about what you mean when you say paying dues, both in the wrestling business, getting into it, and then when you first really get going in the wrestling business.
Well, paying dues, I mean, back then, back in the 60s and 70s, and even part of the early 80s, there was no such thing really as schools, wrestling schools per se. There were wrestlers who trained other wrestlers, but what their job was to stretch you. They were trying to find out what it turned out to be. They were finding out if you could take it. A class, let's say Killer Kowalski. I'm going to use Killer Kowalski as an example. Okay, would start with a class of 20 guys that want to be wrestlers. And after the first day, and he's on record saying this, that after the first day, I'd be lucky to have 5 come back the second day. 15 would quit because of, the abuse that he would put on them. Because they didn't want outsiders. It was a very, very closed society back then. You had to know someone who knew someone who knew someone to get in. Bobby's situation was a little different. He worked at the venue that the WWA performed at every week. He got the job at the venue. That's how he got into the wrestling game. He came in through another way. And yeah, he was, helping with their bags, carrying the bags of the wrestlers. Carrying their jackets from ringside, selling popcorn and soda, and he wasn't old enough at the time to sell beer, but he was just selling popcorn and soda in the stands to the fans. He grew up, he was a fan of wrestling, and I think he was like, let's see. He dropped out of school in the 8th grade, so that makes him roughly what? 13? 14?
11 to 12, 13, 14, in that range. Yeah, early teen.
To help support his mother and grandmother living in, while they were living in Indianapolis, because, like I said, he was born in Chicago. He's originally a Chicago boy. His mother managed an apartment building in Chicago, and back then the apartments were more like hotels, extended stay hotels, and they were very, very nice. I don't know the reason why they moved. I think there was some health issues with his mom and with his grandma. They moved to Indianapolis because his mother had family there. And now, mind you, Bobby's dad wasn't around. I don't know what exactly had happened, but his father wasn't around. And they moved to Indianapolis, and after, like in my notes, it says after the 8th grade, he dropped out of school. So he's only got an 8th grade education, as far as we know.
Well, so we're looking at a guy that's not only got a strong work ethic, but he's got, a real strong sense of family devotion, because he's taking on the responsibilities of being the man of the house at an early age. And that kind of just gives you an idea of the character of Bobby the Brain Heenan, which is kind of interesting when you contrast that with the persona he played, almost against type, really. But we look at Bobby Heenan, and his career stretches so long, from the WWA and the AWA through to the WWF, and then into WCW in the 90s. He was wearing so many hats as a commentator. He would, of course, do all sorts of guest spots in the ring. He would work some matches. Really made a name for himself, though, as a manager. That's kind of what really established him in the wrestling industry. And LegendsLover, to jump in here, we look at Bobby Heenan's run as a manager, particularly, in the AWA, really in his run in the territories before he jumped to New York. If you had to kind of pinpoint one pairing for Bobby Heenan that really kind of stands out, who would you say would be Bobby Heenan's greatest wrestler managed during his AWA run?
Nick Bockwinkel. Nick Bockwinkel was the cornerstone of his career. You figured when he got with Nick, Nick wasn't a champion, but when they got together, got it going, Nick became champion. He ended up in his career in the AWA holding or managing the world's champion and the world tag team champions all at once in his stable. So I would have to say it was Nick Bockwinkel.
In terms of Nick Bockwinkel, kind of give us an idea a little bit, if you can, about who Nick Bockwinkel was. I don't think that a lot of people today have a full appreciation for just how good that he was. In this age of the network where there's only limited AWA material on there, Nick Bockwinkel in his day was considered one of the best wrestlers in the world. What can you tell us a little bit about Nick Bockwinkel during his time with Bobby Heenan?
Well, he was. Nick Bockwinkel he was, I would say, the quiet side of Ric Flair. He dressed the part. He had the money, everything just like Ric Flair. But he wasn't as flamboyant in the way with the words, the loud mouth. He was quiet. He spoke like an educated man. He was a very educated man, and he spoke that way. He presented himself, trying to think of a way to word it, as an intelligent gentleman. But in the ring, he could be a gentleman, he could be slow, or he could be fast. He could even brawl with the best of them. But he was a very sound, very good technical wrestler.
Did you ever get a chance to watch Nick Bockwinkel live and in person?
No, not in person. Not in person, but on TV. And it's just watching him with the technical ease that he could wrestle. Like I said, he could be slow. You could have a match that could run, say it ran an hour. He'd pace himself where he'd make it all the way through. Or he could do it 1, 2, 3 and knock you out. That's how good he was. And he was also very, very trusted by Vern Gagne. So that also made him a big asset because he had the trust of Vern Gagne.
That's actually an interesting kind of segue into, the heart of his AWA run. We've been talking a little bit about, some of the people that he managed. Taker, I know that you have some firsthand experience watching Bobby Heenan live. Of course, last week we talked about the famous cage match at the Chicago Amphitheater, if I'm not mistaken.
No, Soldier Field.
Oh, it was the cage match was at Soldier Field.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So
the two big stadiums. Bob Luce, the promoter in Chicago, would do either a show at Soldier Field or he'd do a show at Comiskey Park every summer. Okay.
Uh-huh.
And the match, like I said, there are clips of the match on YouTube, and you'll find it. But they're like, the longest one I found is like almost 7 minutes. And yes, it's a setup. Bobby Heenan's wearing all white when the match starts with the Blackjacks versus Bruiser and Crusher in a cage match where they're literally padlocked in, no escape. You're not going to escape to win. It's a 1, 2, 3 pin, and all 5 men were bleeding profusely in the words of Gorilla Monsoon, bleeding profusely, or the proverbial crimson mask of Jim Ross's time. And Bobby's white outfit was pink when it was all over.
Very strategic style of attire there to kind of accentuate the violence of the match. That's a classic wrestling trope there. It just kind of shows you what kind of master Bobby Heenan was.
And to make things even funnier, to make things even better, Jersey Joe Walcott, the former heavyweight boxing champion, was a guest referee in that, and I guess Bobby grabbed him at one point, and Jersey Joe punched him in the jaw and cold cocked his ass.
So basically, Mike Tyson and Shawn Michaels lifted that little spot from WrestleMania 14. There we go.
Yeah.
I want to get some firsthand memories of Bobby Heenan. Of course, you talk about the cage match, and of course, y'all watched him on TV. What was Bobby like as a character in the AWA compared to what he would become later on in the WWF? Was there a difference with Heenan in the AWA, or was it pretty much the same package, just a little bit earlier on in his career?
It was basically the same package. I mean, Bobby Heenan could talk. He could talk. He could. I use this expression when it comes to my grandfather, and I'll use it when it comes to Bobby. What his job was, what the wrestler's job was back then, because there wasn't the things like Monday Night Raw. There wasn't the network. There was no such thing as pay-per-views back then. Bobby and the wrestlers all did the same thing. They would try to sell the matches that they're going to be in and put an ass every 18 inches. And for those of you that don't understand, a seat at a wrestling venue is approximately 18 inches wide. So 18 inches is a seat. And Bobby could sell ice to an Eskimo and make the Eskimo believe it's the greatest thing since sliced bread. It's the truth. He could sell a match. He could sell you something because, they told long arc stories. I mean, some of the rivalries and feuds would last months. I mean, months. And it would just keep going on that loop. And most all the time, the heels would go over. The heels that very seldom ever got to come up, and which would drive the fans nuts.
Actually, you get some of the feuds that would go longer than that. They could go years and years. And with Bobby Heenan, his job is to rile people up. His job is to be hated. He was Chicago, because you figured that was his hometown. He was the most hated person in wrestling in Chicago. Chicago loved to hate him. And that's what made Bobby Heenan. His job was to bring the heat down on him and build his wrestlers up. That was his job.
Yeah,
and he did a damn good job at it.
Well, that's what I wanted to focus on right quick, and I wanted to kind of pick your brain at this because a lot of people like myself who are Bobby Heenan fans, there's only so much you can glean, by going on and watching some of his matches on YouTube, some of the people that he managed. What were some of the seminal moments in the AWA for Heenan, that stand out in your mind? Are there any particular feuds that Heenan and his wrestlers had that kind of best exemplify what made Bobby Heenan so special?
So many. Well, the one we talked about briefly was the Blackjacks, Lanza and Mulligan, and the Bruiser and the Crusher. It was also Stevens and Bockwinkel, Bruiser Crusher. You would put like LL said, Bruiser and Crusher were two top guys. in AWA back in that time. Top guys for a long time. I mean, I'm gonna segue here a little bit. Bruiser and Crusher were the AWA Tag Team Champions when they lost to the Road Warriors, and they basically abused those two, and that's public knowledge.
But talk about some brawls. Oof.
Yeah. Because they were two of the most beloved characters and two of the most beloved wrestlers in the AWA. You know, the world's most dangerous wrestler in Dick the Bruiser and the man who made Milwaukee famous in the Crusher. But it was, you know, you put Bobby with anybody, they were immediately legitimate. You know. And the famous statement that he used in WWF/E was, you know, the family. He started that actually in AWA, but he never had a name for it. Because he managed people like Nick Bockwinkel, Ray Stevens, Ernie Ladd, Bobby Duncombe, the Blackjacks. You know, that's just a small sample of the plethora of wrestlers that he managed during his time in the wrestling industry. And his like LL said, it was his job to bring the heat down. He was the heater, so to speak, and it was his job to bring the heat down on his charges. But there was also another thing that he did. That's something that, you know, managing is something that one other manager that I know of did it. Bobby took care of their traveling. He set up all their travel, all their rental cars. You know, took care of their money, you know, made sure they made their bookings on time, were at all their bookings. You know, a manager back in those days was actually a manager. And there's only one other person that I know of that did it, and that was Percy Pringle the third, also known as Paul Bearer for Undertaker.
I think also Paul Ellering would do a little bit of that with the Road Warriors in the 80s.
Yeah, he did do that. Yes, he did. You're right. You are correct. And
it wasn't a little bit. Paul Ellering, he took over. He actually did all the books and all the managing. But Jim Cornette also did some of that.
The manager slot was not a character, so to speak. A manager spot was actually just that. A manager.
Well, you know, that's an interesting subject that I want to talk about, because we talk about the wrestling manager and how Bobby Heenan kind of established himself as the greatest of all time. But for a lot of newer listeners, you know, it really comes to you that they may not really appreciate what a wrestling manager does on the air, because outside of very rare instances like a Paul Heyman, wrestling managers have almost gone extinct. So let's talk a little bit about what a wrestling manager was expected to do, you know, for the people he was working for. We just talked a little bit about some of the backstage work and getting their travel situated and kind of taking care of the wrestlers on the road. But what was expected of a manager on the air? You know, how did a manager really make his money in the business? Because there are instances of Jim Cornette being a notable example where the managers are getting paid the same amount that the people they're managing are getting paid, and they're not having to work the match all the time.
Right. They got paid well, but, you know, they also, their job was to distract the referee, interfere in the match in a way that they don't get caught, i.e. grabbing a leg when the wrestler, and then stand there looking like, I didn't do nothing. In the meantime, if you listen to the crowds, the crowd would see it. The referee always he was always looking the other way when the manager or Bobby would stick his hand out and grab a foot and trip the guy up and he would fall. We all knew that the referee knew what was coming. We do now anyway. We didn't back then, but you want to talk about heat or passing the ever illustrious foreign object, the brass knuckles, the roll of quarters, or roll of dimes, the chain, you know, the dog collar chain, all the stuff that you would see that you don't really see anymore. That was his job. Plus, bringing heat down on his wrestlers while the match was going on. That was the job.
Also, another one is if you think about it, then a lot of the managers then actually had wrestling experience. They were wrestlers in their own right. They would end up taking bumps. They would be so hated by others where sometimes they did have to wrestle a match. They would have to go in and wrestle. Or you could have two managers wrestling each other. But the manager, a lot of them always took some kind of a hit, some kind of a bump. And it was always because they're trying to protect their wrestlers.
Yeah. And if you look at some of the older footage on YouTube, that's where you'll find most of it about Bobby. You'll see he's wearing a singlet type. It had a single strap that went from the right shoulder across his body, but he wore a singlet and boots a lot of times to the ring because he would be wrestling on the card either earlier or later in the show. You know, they're doing the ever illustrious dark match. Because Bobby was a good wrestler. He was a natural at wrestling as well, which was something that Dick found out.
Well, I want to talk about this a little bit as well, because this actually brings up a very fascinating aspect of Bobby Heenan's work. You know, LegendsLover was mentioning how a lot of managers were former wrestlers that had kind of transitioned into the managerial role, so that's how they kind of adapted themselves to being able to take bumps. Of course, James J. Dillon was an example of this from the NWA. We have Bobby Heenan here who did some wrestling. He kind of gravitated into the managerial role. I want to ask both of you the same question and get both of you to weigh in. In the litany of great managers, because there's been so many over the years, do you think Bobby Heenan, probably better than any of the others, was the best at taking those, you know, crazy bumps when the baby faces would get a hold of them? Was there a manager that ever bumped as well as Bobby Heenan?
No. Bobby Heenan, like I said, I saw him go into a post at Chicago's amphitheater, International Amphitheater, and he came up bleeding. And that's a manager. He was managing Stevens that night. Ray Stevens was by himself in a singles match with Dick the Bruiser. Heenan went to interfere, got caught by Dick. Dick drew him into the post, and he came up bleeding. Today, you know, even in you know, I'm going to segue a little bit here. Even Paul Heyman during the Attitude Era, you know, and all the Ruthless Aggression era, you wouldn't see Paul Heyman bleed. You didn't see any managers bleed. You saw the wrestlers bleed, but you didn't see the managers bleed. That's what sets Bobby Heenan apart. Bobby Heenan knew how to take a bump, worked in the ring, as well as a manager. He got injured. That's why he had to get out of the ring. He would have the occasional Weasel suit match, but that's later on. And those are legendary. Those matches there, those Weasel suit matches were legendary.
Also, you got managers for humiliation. Bobby Heenan, out of all the managers, was the most that was humiliated the most. Like, he brought up the Weasel suit. He had his tuxedo stripped off of him in the middle of the ring. He was knocked out, beaten, and stuffed into a Weasel suit and made to run around. You don't find many managers that were humiliated as much as Bobby Heenan.
Yep, he took a lot of humiliation, but he made a lot of money doing it. So
that quintessential willingness to make yourself look like a fool in order to get the product over. It's a kind of selflessness that the greats, especially the heels, have. You know, I think there's a reputation among some wrestlers today, and I'm not a wrestler. I don't want to put words in anyone's mouth, but you know, there seems to be this feeling that if you ever quote unquote show ass, which is the expression, where you kind of make yourself look like a fool, that you're a fool forever. And yet, even though Bobby Heenan, you know, is remembered today as one of the greatest, you know, all around performers in wrestling history, as y'all were just alluding to, there were plenty of times where Bobby would make himself look like a fool, you know, because that's how he got angles over. You had to let the baby faces get their just due every once in a while. You had to let the baby faces get a little bit over on the heels, because if the heels always won constantly and the heroes never prevailed, then there was no reason for the fans to tune in. So Bobby Heenan played a great foil that got a chance to give the fans what they wanted to see, and what they really wanted to see in the AWA was Bobby Heenan
getting his ass kicked.
Get the tar beat out of him.
But you also think of this. All through Bobby's career, even as a color commentator, he played a heel his whole career. Even as a color commentator, he took humiliation from his best friend, Gorilla Monsoon. They used to go back and forth, but he stayed true and stayed a heel through his whole career.
Will you stop?
We're going to have an entire episode on Gorilla Monsoon, too. And we could probably do an entire episode just on Bobby and Gorilla commentating.
Oh, God. Those two in commentary.
Primetime wrestling.
That would be great.
Now,
I would never laugh so hard. It's like I can't remember. I think it was WrestleMania 3 or 4. I can't remember which. But there's a point where Bobby Heenan is so upset about something that went on in the match. And Gorilla keeps telling him, "Don't jump! Don't jump!" You know exactly what I'm talking about, Biff. I know you heard it.
Well, he did it more than once. I think he got him at the 92 Rumble with that at one point during the match. But I think it was at WrestleMania. I think it was in the build-up to WrestleMania 3.
Don't jump!
The aftermath. Yeah.
There's only one time that I can think of that Bobby didn't play the heel that he always did. And that's when he went, after he was diagnosed with his cancer and left WWE, he went back to WCW, the time of the Monday Night Wars with the NWO.
Yeah.
He played more of a face because he didn't like what was going on there. Yeah. That is the only time you see Bobby switch a bit, is when it came to that. Else, he stayed the heel.
Yeah.
And he played comic relief.
He was definitely one of the funniest performers that ever worked in the business. If you got a chance to listen to him on commentary, for me personally, I can jump in here a little bit on this. You know, I first started watching wrestling in 1989, and I was kind of the oddball in the family. I started watching WWF when most of my family was still NWA. I didn't really jump into the NWA and WCW until I was a little bit older, so I was kind of reared in wrestling on Bobby Heenan, not so much as a manager. I mean, he still managed, you know, up through around 91, early 92, but mostly as a commentator. SummerSlam 91, WrestleMania 8, WrestleMania 7 even, he was on commentary for a bit, and of course, the quintessential Bobby Heenan performance on commentary at the 92 Royal Rumble, still the greatest Rumble ever, and I won't hear any debate on that. But, you know, you look at Heenan as a commentator, you look at him as a manager, as a wrestler even, you know, even though he wouldn't be considered, you know, a Ric Flair or a Jack Briscoe in the ring, he's still a great worker in the sense that he could make entertaining matches. He could entertain you with virtually anything that the promoters gave him, and I think that's what made Bobby so special.
Yeah. Bobby was a special man. I mean, I look at the list. I can tell you, based on this is just a singles wrestlers he did. One, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 36 singles in his career he wrestled. He managed.
That's pretty crazy when you think about his longevity. I mean,
And that's everybody from Nick Bockwinkel all the way down to CM Punk.
That's quite the list right there. That's
some names of note that people will know. Like you said, we talked about Nick. We talked about Ray. You talked about Bobby Duncombe. He managed Ken Patera. He managed Baron Von Raschke, Ernie Ladd, Austin Idol, who's now NWA's manager of the current champion.
Nick Aldis, correct.
Nick Aldis. Bobby Jaggers, there's a name.
Wow.
Well, I wonder if anybody recognized the Red Rooster.
Yep.
Oh, yeah.
Terry Taylor.
Yeah. Now, here's a name that's pretty familiar to people in the WWE. He's a color commentator now for NXT. His name is Nigel McGuinness.
Bobby Heenan and Nigel McGuinness work together?
Yep.
Wow. You got to tell us a little bit about that if you can, because I didn't.
All I have was a list. I don't know anything more about it. I mean, you got the Barbarian, you got the Red Rooster, you got High Chief Offie, Rick Rude, Colt Cabana, Ric Flair, Lex Luger. I can go on.
It's you could make an entire Hall of Fame out of the guys that Heenan managed. I mean, you just named some of them. I mean, even some of the names that may not be as memorable today to newer fans, guys like the Missing Link or Adrian Adonis, Buddy Rose.
But the thing is that that's just the singles, the shirtless. What about the tag teams he had?
Oh my goodness, you could go on forever there. Of course.
Yeah, he managed the father of Randy Savage, and that's Angelo Poffo and Chris Markoff.
Mm-hmm.
The Blackjacks, of course, the Assassins, Guy Mitchell and Joe Tommaso.
The Islanders.
Yeah, Haku and Tama. That's a shout out to the Anawai family. The Brainbusters.
Yep, Brainbusters. Got to mention the
Brainbusters, Arn Anderson and Tully. And the Colossal Connection is Andre the Giant and Haku. Now, that would have been, if Andre would have been a little younger, oh, God.
Wow. Well, even at that point in time, even though he was of limited mobility, that's still a hell of a tag team.
Yeah, they were champions.
Yeah.
Everybody on that list, on both lists, were champions of one form or another during their career while they were with Bobby.
I want to bring up something particular because I know Taker, you in particular, you have, and LegendsLover does too, you have a knowledge of, kind of a wide range of the territories. You kind of got your start in that Midwestern AWA region. You kind of grew up on that. And then you also have some other experiences over the course of your fandom. One of the interesting things that I learned doing research for this episode, there was a brief period where Bobby's run in the AWA was interrupted by a jump down to Georgia Championship Wrestling, which is a little bit closer to my wheelhouse.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you a question, and LegendsLover, you feel free to jump in here too. What would be the best way for new fans to understand the difference between the type of wrestling you would see in the Midwest and the type of wrestling that was more endemic to the Southern territories? Was there a big difference? Was it a big culture shift, or were the two styles somewhat compatible?
Having seen both, I don't know if she's really seen the older stuff, and I didn't see Bobby in Georgia Championship Wrestling. I'm going to be perfectly honest with you.
I didn't either. I know he was down there.
He was only down there for maybe a year. He went down there for maybe a year. Now, mind you, before we go any further, Vern had a policy in the AWA, and this is while Bobby was there, that you had to give a 6-week notice. Whenever Bobby was going somewhere else, going to leave, the 6 weeks notice was to finish all your book dates, and they would write you out. And Bobby, to his credit, always worked his 6 weeks. Gave his notice and worked his 6 weeks, and then he would go on. That's why he would go back. Because back in that time, wrestlers would just up and leave overnight for one reason or another. Here again lies the trust. Because Nick was AWA through his entire career. He never spent any time in a WWE ring, ever. He started in the AWA and he finished in the AWA. He was there when Vern closed the doors. He became an agent for the WWE. That was it.
Yeah, and we'll see, one of the things that I think, we should touch on here, and just kind of laying out, and this is as much a testament to how great Bobby Heenan was.
But you were asking what the differences were?
Yeah, because not everybody that worked in the northern territories, like New York or the AWA, could really make it in the South and vice versa. There did seem to be kind of a culture shift when you crossed the Mason-Dixon line back in those days.
Yeah, well, in the North more so, the lines were very, very solid between heels and faces. Most of your faces were pure technical wrestlers. You didn't see a lot of flippy-do shit. There wasn't any flippy-do shit back then. And most of your heels were just straight-out brawlers. There were a few that were technical wrestlers, but they always bent the rules. They always figured out a way to bend it. And in the North, it was more shoot style, not so much choreograph like it is down south. There was more choreography down south. It was more of a ballet type wrestling down south. It was a little faster paced down south. That was the biggest difference I saw.
Plus, you also got the way the fans were. The fans in the North were a little bit different than the ones in the South, too. So you had to accommodate the fans.
I'm so glad that you brought that up. That is an excellent point, and that really speaks to the heart of what it meant to be a successful territorial competitor or performer. And that's, kind of what we were alluding to with Bobby Heenan. You had to play to the fans. Not every fan was alike. Not every city in a territory was alike. And certainly not every territory was, the same. It was a difference in presentation from the AWA to Championship Wrestling from Florida to Mid-Atlantic Wrestling to World Class. You had to be able to adjust your style depending on the territory that you were in. And that was not an easy transition. It wasn't like if you were good in the AWA, you were guaranteed to be good in the WWF or in Kansas City. You really had to ply your trade and be versatile to adapt to whatever marketplace you were in. And I think that's what speaks to Bobby Heenan's greatness. When he went down to Georgia Championship Wrestling, he's not just working as a scrub manager. He's managing some of the biggest names that they had at that time. Guys like the Masked Superstar and Ernie Ladd. Ernie Ladd's one of the most important superstars in the history of that era of wrestling. And so for Bobby Heenan to be paired off with him, that's not just, a huge testament to Bobby Heenan in that moment, but that's a huge testament to Bobby's ability to cross those boundaries and work pretty much anywhere that he went and work at a high level.
Bobby had a reputation as a solid worker, as a solid manager, and could get, the proper amount of heat. Bobby was one of those people that could look at a crowd and judge a crowd. I mean, you mentioned something very interesting, this, town to town. Yeah. Some towns on their circuits were heel towns. Period. If the heels didn't win, they would riot. Some towns were face towns. If the faces didn't win, they would riot. I mean, there's an incident in Chicago with Bobby where a fan became so incensed with Bobby and so angry that he actually pulled a pistol out and shot at Bobby. He didn't hit him. He injured 5 other people in the stands, but he didn't hit Bobby. And the cops never were able to find him. Bobby saw him a few more times at public events and was always scared that guy was actually going to kill him.
But this is what this is the fans that are different from the fans now. The fans believed what they seen. They made their storylines, they made everything so real that the fans would believe it. Where now, if you listen to the way fans are now, it's what they want, when they want. They don't get it. They can tell what is real and what isn't. Where back in the day, everything looked real because they made it look real.
Hell, they lived their gimmicks 24/7.
Which they don't do now.
I want to put both of you on the spot, and I don't want anybody listening to think this was planned out, because this is not. I'm going to catch my co-host off guard here a little bit with this, but I want, Legends Lover and Taker's Minion to both kind of unequivocally set the record straight. If you had your choice of watching the AWA wrestling from the 1970s or the current product that WWE puts out, which one would y'all choose? Because I think I know which answer both of y'all are going to give.
Sorry, I'd go back to the 1970s.
So would I.
That's what I thought.
And don't get me wrong, I enjoy wrestling even now, but it's not the same. And people who know me know this. I sit there and I pine for the old days. I pine for them. I miss the Crimson Masks. I miss all that stuff. It's not what's the word? It's not something that's really accepted. Well, it is, but it is though. If you look at the movies nowadays versus the movies back then, you have a lot of blood and gore movies today that you wouldn't have had back then due to censorship. But in a wrestling ring, you would have blood everywhere. Now, the movies are more bloody than the wrestling is. Jim Ross says it best. If you're going to punch someone in the face with a closed fist, why aren't they bleeding? Why? Answer that question, people. Why?
It is one of the great mysteries of the pro wrestling business today, at how not only the mechanics of some of the matches work, but how they can do some of the moves they do. Today's product is absolutely, the pinnacle of athleticism and agility. But I tell you, there's just something about watching the storytellers. And that may sound so hipster coming from somebody my age, but the storytellers that used to make wrestling so much fun, it's really a lost art. But I personally think that the greats could be great during any era. And I think we would all agree here that Bobby Heenan had the talent to be great no matter when he was performing in the business. The cream will always rise to the top. And I think Bobby Heenan would definitely qualify as the cream of the crop.
Yeah, well, when I hear people saying that Paul Heyman is the greatest manager of all time, I look at him and I say, you haven't seen Bobby Heenan when he was managing. Anybody who says that to me, I just look at him and say, and you've been a fan how long?
That's actually the point.
I hear that even on Raw from Cole and from Graves and from Saxton and from Coach. And it's like, guys, You have the greatest manager of all time in the goddamn Hall of Fame. Acknowledge the fact. You have some of the greatest managers in the Hall of Fame. Bobby Heenan, Lou Albano, J.J. Dillon, Cornette, Jimmy Hart.
The mouth of the South.
The mouth of the South. I mean, there's 5 guys right there that will never be equaled. And the only time J.J. Dillon was the manager was with the Four Horsemen. That's the only faction he ever managed was the Horsemen. He had no other wrestlers but the Horsemen.
And he was with them for years.
Well, I gathered that Taker would probably be willing to call Bobby Heenan his greatest of all time.
No. He isn't mine. He is.
Okay. So that's your pick for greatest of all time. Bobby Heenan, flat out. LegendsLover.
He is the template of all managers. Everybody. I mean, you look at Paul Heyman. He strives to be Bobby Heenan, and he'll tell you that. Bobby Heenan is his hero. And he says he doesn't hold a candle to Bobby. He knows he's way down the list. And he says he has said he doesn't like being said that he's the greatest of all time because he knows he's not.
Jim Cornette's the same way.
Yep.
He'll always shine away when somebody calls him the greatest. LL, do you agree? Bobby Heenan, your GOAT?
For me personally, my favorite one is Jimmy Hart. But for the best manager of all time, I'd have to concede it's Bobby Heenan.
Yeah, there's no way to get around a discussion of the greatest performers in the history of the business, whether you're looking at the managers, the announcers, the wrestlers. You know, Bobby Heenan, he's just got that force of nature about him, that personality that's larger than life. And by all accounts, he was anything but. He was a humble, down-to-earth guy, a really great guy to know. Of course, he had all sorts of friends in the business. I've never heard anyone say a bad word in any shoot interview about Bobby Heenan. It's almost always effusive praise for what Bobby Heenan did. And, you know, we're talking here tonight about, you know, one of our favorite performers, someone that we all grew up watching. That's the great thing about it. Even, you know, despite the differences in the time periods that we started watching, we all grew up with this guy. It was kind of a neat way to connect us here.
Well, you think of this. How many generations, how many decades did Bobby go through? Bobby's career started in 1965. And I mean, for manager, he went from 65 to 93 as the manager. Commentator, he didn't start until 86.
Yeah, he was wearing both hats for a while as a commentator, as a man, and a manager. I mean, hell, when Ric Flair first came, and this you could see it on the network, folks. Bobby talks about it. He said he was happy to be working with Ric Flair, but he didn't realize he was working with Larry Flint.
Yeah,
after 2 weeks, he says he went to Vince and said, "I can't handle this. I can't handle this."
No, that's when Ric Flair came back. We're at the end of his career in WWF. Bobby Heenan came back with him. So you figure Bobby Heenan went through how many decades?
Almost 3.
Yeah. 65 to 93, 94. That's a lot of years.
It's a long period of time. It is one of the greatest eras in wrestling. Bobby Heenan is in and out of some of the biggest moments. You know, we have so much more that we can talk about, and we're going to. This is only part 1 of our look at Bobby Heenan. Next week, we're going to continue. We're going to focus on his jump to the WWF. Of course, we have so many moments that we haven't even discussed yet. We're going to talk more about his partnership with Ric Flair in the early 90s. We got to talk about the biggest match in wrestling history, Hulk Hogan and Andre the Giant. And how Bobby Heenan kind of set the stage for that. You know, there's just so much to cover, and we're going to be looking more into Bobby Heenan's run next week as we continue with part 2, looking at his career in the WWF. But that's where we're going to leave it here tonight, guys. It's been a great episode. I hope everybody has enjoyed it. Got to get some plugs out here, though. We have some podcasts that we really want you to take a listen to. Of course, a good friend of the show, Metal Matt from Cage Side Seats, promotes the Ruthless Aggression Era podcast. That drops Friday evenings. I believe Matt's going to be going on vacation here soon, but definitely be sure to check in the Ruthless Aggression Era podcast on YouTube. He's got some great shows cataloged there. Of course, the Violent Wrestling podcast with Ambrose Alley and Prince Moxley Lopez, my partner in crime there, Mox. They have shows kind of drop sporadically, but definitely be sure to check them out. They do a great job. Of course, we have all of the Cage Side Seats podcasts. Be sure to keep it tuned. Really, Cage Side Seats is the epicenter for all sorts of great content. You know, you just want to stick close to the daily and nightly threads. If there's a podcast out there from the Cage Side Seats family, you're going to find it there. Of course, we have our associated shows. The Godfather has his legendary offering, the Greatest Wrestling Podcast for my money on Saturday mornings with Doc Senju. That is the Shooting the Breeze podcast that drops 11 a.m. Eastern on YouTube every single week. And sometimes they even let me come in and make it into a clown car. Yeah, stir the pot a little bit. Of course, we got the Queen City Express podcast. It's the greatest show you're not listening to. It drops Thursday afternoons, 4 p.m. Eastern. Myself and Ryan Sayo. We talk a little bit of wrestling goodness. Be sure to subscribe to this channel. If you like what you hear, be sure and drop a like. You know, we're doing this because we love wrestling and we want you to enjoy wrestling just as we do, because the more people love it, the more people can experience what made us all fans. This is the Connoisseurs of Wrestling on behalf of the...
Hey, what about us, guy? You forgot about our contact points, buddy. Hello.
I am a failure tonight. I am an utter failure. Where can they find you at there, Taker's Minion?
You can find me on Twitter at Takers_Minion. That's all in lowercase letters. You can find me in a daily and in a nightly. And as you stated, I have the podcast every Saturday morning that goes live at 11 a.m. Eastern, 10 a.m. Central. However, for the Big Four pay-per-views, we go on 1 hour early. This podcast that we're doing every Sunday night will be preempted for any pay-per-view. So whatever pay-per-view is coming up, which is, I believe, Money in the Bank, and that's next month. I'm not exactly sure what date that is now. I can't think of it off the top of my head. We will not be broadcasting that night because we do not want to interfere with your enjoyment of Money in the Bank.
Although, to be completely fair, given how crappy Backlash was, we may be doing them a favor by going on the air.
Yeah, I was thinking that's why I was kind of sarcastic in your enjoyment.
Oh, LegendsLover, where can they find you at?
Well, they can find me at Windstorm64 at Twitter. And they can find me sometimes on the daily and sometimes on the nightly.
You know, yeah, it's imperative. If you haven't joined up, please do. Cage Side Seats is such a great community. We got a lot of great people. People that are producing content like this, people that are producing fan posts over there. They run a good ship at Cage Side Seats, and it's a real great place to get your wrestling fix. You can find me on the Twitter machine at RealDealBiff. Contact information down in the little handy-dandy info box. I think that's going to do it here. We've got all sorts of great shows lined up. We're going to finish up on our talk with Bobby Heenan next week. And from there, the sky's the limit. It's going to be a real fun ride with LegendsLover and Taker's Minion, the greatest couple in podcasting. I am your host with the most, Biff Kensington, signing off for another episode of the Connoisseurs of Wrestling. We'll see you next week, guys. Take care. Bye-bye then.
Good night, folks.
Good night.